In 2003, a furniture heir spent a fortune buying 23,000 acres of the Scottish Highlands that almost everyone else considered worthless. The mountains were bare. The ancient forest that once covered them had been reduced to a handful of dying trees. So he built a fence, planted nearly 1 million native trees, and slashed the deer population by 80%. 2 decades later, government scientists walked into that fenced forest, tested it against 15 separate criteria for a healthy woodland, and watched it pass every single one. But the most important discovery was about what was still missing. To understand why a fence could bring a forest back from the dead, you first have to understand what killed it. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated, a great forest spread across Scotland. The Romans called it the Great Wood of Caledon. At its peak, woodland covered as much as 70% of the country, a vast expanse of Scots pine, birch, rowan, juniper, and aspen stretching across the highlands. This was the Caledonian forest, a globally unique habitat that exists nowhere else on Earth. It was alive with species found in no other British landscape. Pine martens hunted through the canopy. Red squirrels and crossbills fed on pine cones. Capercaillie, a giant grouse the size of a turkey, displayed in forest clearings. Wood ants built meter-high nests. Rare wildflowers like twinflower and creeping lady's tresses grew in the dappled shade. And moving through it all were the large mammals that shaped the entire system: wild boar, lynx, brown bear, and the apex predator that kept everything in balance, the wolf. Then, over thousands of years, humans took the forest apart. They cleared it for timber, for fuel, for charcoal, and for grazing land. They burned it to flush out wolves and game. By the time the clearances were finished, the Great Wood of Caledon was gone. Today, less than 4% of Scotland is covered by native woodland. Only 84 fragments of the original Caledonian pinewood remain, scattered across the highlands like the last embers of a fire that once filled the country. And the fragments that survived were dying. The reason they were dying was not logging. The logging had largely stopped. The reason was an animal, one that had once belonged in the forest, but had multiplied out of control because the forest's predators were gone. The red deer is a magnificent creature, Britain's largest land mammal. In a balanced ecosystem, its numbers are held in check by wolves and lynx. But Scotland's wolves were hunted to extinction. The last wolf in Scotland was killed in the late 1600s. With the predators gone, and with sporting estates actively encouraging large deer herds for hunting, the red deer population exploded. Today, there are around 400,000 red deer in Scotland. Deer eat trees. Specifically, they eat saplings, the young, tender seedlings that represent a forest's next generation. In a Caledonian pinewood with high deer numbers, every pine seedling that pokes above the heather is browsed off before it can grow. The mature trees, known affectionately as granny pines, grow older and older. They set seed. The seeds germinate, and every single seedling is eaten. The granny pines eventually die of old age, and nothing replaces them. The forest does not get cut down. It simply fails to reproduce, and slowly, tree by tree, it ages into nothing. This was the exact situation at a remote pinewood fragment in Sutherland, in the far north of the Highlands. It was the second most northerly surviving fragment of Caledonian pinewood in the world. It had been recognized as a site of special scientific interest in 1979 and as a European Special Area of Conservation in 2005. NatureScot, the Scottish government's nature agency, had classified it as being in unfavorable and declining condition. It was a forest on its deathbed. This fragment sat on a sporting estate called Alladale. In 2003, Alladale was bought by a man named Paul Lister. Lister was the heir to a furniture manufacturing fortune, but he had no interest in running Alladale as the Victorian deer stalking estate it had always been. He had traveled through the wild forests of Romania and other parts of Europe, and he had come back with a conviction that the Scottish Highlands, which most people regard as beautiful, rugged, and natural, were in fact ecologically devastated. As his reserve manager would later put it, the Highlands are among the most damaged landscapes in the world. Strip away the romance, and you are left with bare mountains and barren hillsides, beautiful but close to an ecological dead zone. Lister wanted to bring the forest back. He renamed the estate the Alladale Wilderness Reserve and founded a conservation organization called the European Nature Trust. His vision was enormous and, to many, outlandish, to restore the Caledonian forest across his land and, eventually, to reintroduce the native species that had vanished from it, including, one day, the wolf. The press nicknamed him the Wolf Man. But before any wolves, there was a more immediate problem to solve: the dying pinewood. And the solution was not glamorous, it was a fence. Working with NatureScot and the Scottish Rural Development Programme, the Alladale team fenced off the ancient pinewood fragment. The barrier ran for kilometers around and through the reserve's woodland areas, sealing the surviving trees away from the deer. The principle was simple: if the deer could not reach the seedlings could grow. At the same time, Lister's team went to war on the deer numbers across the wider estate. Over the years, they reduced the red deer population on the reserve from around 2,500 animals down to roughly 500, a cut of 80%. They were doing, with rifles and fences, the job that wolves had once done with teeth. Then they helped the forest along. The Alladale team planted almost 1 million native trees across the reserve: Scots pine, rowan, willow, juniper, and birch, the species that had always belonged there. They restored over 500 acres of damaged peatland, using small dams to block erosion channels and re-wet the bog, locking carbon back into the ground. They reintroduced red squirrels. They began a breeding program for the critically endangered Scottish wildcat. And then they waited. Because the real test was not what they could plant. It was whether the forest, freed from the deer, could finally begin to grow on its own. It could. Inside the fence, the transformation was profound. Where 2 decades earlier there had been only a few aging granny pines surrounded by close-cropped heather, there was now a thriving, expanding young forest. Pine seedlings that would have been eaten in their first year were growing into saplings, then into trees. Rowan, willow, and juniper were spreading and increasing in both area and abundance. For the first time in generations, the Caledonian pinewood at Alladale had a next generation. In the summer of 2023, NatureScot staff returned to the site to formally assess it. They measure the health of a Caledonian pinewood against 15 separate criteria, evaluating every layer of the woodland, from the canopy down to the health of the individual trees, the shrub layer, the ground vegetation, and all the way down to the soil itself. To be classed as being in favorable condition, a woodland must pass each test. The Alladale pinewood passed all 15. The forest that NatureScot had once written off as unfavorable and declining was now officially in favorable condition. The surveyor who carried out the assessment reported something striking. The survey was surprisingly hard physical work, because in the absence of heavy deer browsing, the heather and the bleaberry had grown so tall and dense that simply walking across the hillside to conduct the survey was exhausting. The undergrowth, suppressed for centuries, had come roaring back. The ground layer, the shrub layer, the young trees, the soil, all of it was alive again. Jeanette Hall, a NatureScot woodland specialist, called it a wonderful transformation of an ancient pinewood, at exactly the moment when nature restoration matters most for tackling the biodiversity and climate crises. The reserve manager, Innes McNeil, summed up the Alladale philosophy in a single line. He said, "We will leave the land in better condition than it was found." The recovering forest pulled wildlife back with it. Red squirrels, reintroduced to the reserve, established themselves in the growing woodland. The estate became a stronghold for Scottish wildcats, Britain's rarest mammal, bred on site as part of the national effort to save the species from extinction. Pine martens, raptors, and a host of woodland birds and insects returned to habitat that had been missing for generations. In 2021, the BBC flagship nature program, Springwatch, broadcast live from Alladale, showcasing the abundance of wildlife that had returned to a place that had been, within living memory, a barren hillside. But here is where the Alladale story becomes something more than a feel-good tale about a fence and a million trees. Because the people who run it are the first to admit that the fence is not the answer. It is a workaround. A fence is expensive. It must be constantly maintained. It keeps deer out of one small area while doing nothing for the vast landscape beyond it. And critically, the 80% reduction in deer at Alladale was achieved by human marksmen doing, imperfectly and at great cost, the work that a natural predator would do for free. The forest inside the fence is healthy, but it is a forest on life support, dependent on human management to survive. The thing that would make it truly self-sustaining, the thing that vanished in the 1600s, is still missing. That missing piece is the wolf. For years, Paul Lister's dream of reintroducing wolves to Alladale was dismissed as the fantasy of an eccentric millionaire. But in February of 2025, the science caught up with the vision. A team led by Professor Dominic Spracklin at the University of Leeds published the first rigorous assessment of what wolves could actually do for the Scottish Highlands. Using a predator-prey model, the researchers estimated that reintroducing wolves across 4 regions of the Highlands, the Cairngorms, the Southwest Highlands, the Central Highlands, and the Northwest Highlands, would lead to a self-sustaining population of around 167 wolves. That population would be enough to bring red deer densities below 4 animals per square kilometer, the threshold at which browsing pressure drops low enough for trees to regenerate naturally without fences and without rifles. And the climate implications were staggering. The study calculated that the native woodland expansion driven by wolf predation could capture around 1 million tons of carbon dioxide every year, roughly 5% of the entire carbon removal target that the UK's Climate Change Committee says the nation's woodlands need to hit to reach net zero by 2050. The researchers worked out that each individual wolf, through its effect on deer and forest, would be responsible for sequestering over 6,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. In carbon finance terms, that makes a single wolf worth around £154,000. This was no longer a fairy tale, it was a peer-reviewed climate strategy with 4 legs. And yet, the wolves are not coming. At least, not yet. In a 2025 Freedom of Information response, the Scottish Government stated its position plainly. It has no plans to reintroduce wolves or any other large carnivorous species into Scotland. The barriers are not primarily ecological, they are human. Scotland has a freedom to roam law that gives the public the right to walk almost anywhere across the landscape, including private estates, a right that becomes complicated when the landscape contains a pack of wild wolves. Farmers fear for their livestock. Rural communities are wary. The memory of why wolves were exterminated in the first place runs deep. So for now, the Scottish forest is being rebuilt the hard way, with fences, with planting, with culling, and with the patience of people like the Alladale team who have spent 2 decades proving that the land can heal if you give it the chance. Today, the pinewood at Alladale is no longer a fragment waiting to die. It is a living, expanding, self-seeding forest, officially recognized as healthy, surrounded by hillsides where nearly 1 million young trees are taking root and peat bogs are soaking up carbon once more. The granny pines finally have grandchildren. The lesson of Alladale is twofold, and it is bigger than one Scottish estate. The first lesson is that nature is astonishingly resilient. A forest that had been reduced to a handful of dying trees, that scientists had formally written off, came back to full health in 20 years for one simple reason. Someone stopped the thing that was eating it. Remove the pressure, and life returns faster than anyone expects. The second lesson is harder. The fence at Alladale worked, but it is a cage around a symptom. The real wound in the Scottish Highlands is not a shortage of trees. It is a missing predator, an entire layer of the ecosystem that was torn out 3 centuries ago and never replaced. You can plant 1 million trees and build a fence around them. But a forest that needs humans with rifles to survive is not yet wild. It is a garden. What grew inside that fence proved the forest still remembers how to live. What is still missing outside it is the wolf that would let it live on its own. It turns out that bringing a dead forest back to life is the easy part. The hard part is being brave enough to bring back everything that made it a forest in the first place.